So for our last video of this unit, we're going to be looking into the heterotrophic organisms, which will be the fungi and the animals. Let's start with the fungi. These guys are multicellular, they're sessile, meaning they don't move, and they're decomposers. So they're going to be breaking down things that are already dead with cell walls made of chitin. So now we have cell walls kind of similar to a plant, but it's a different material. In plants, the cell wall was made of cellulose, and in the fungi, we're now using chitin. Like the animals, we are heterotrophic, meaning we eat other organisms. We cannot produce our own organic molecules using an inorganic source. We have to consume organic sources. And so genetically speaking, given these similarities, we are closer to fungi, or fungi are closer to us than they are to plants. And so this is going to include things like mushrooms, including the ones you may eat, molds, and yeasts. And so the bodies of fungi are made of networks of mycelium. These are these long filaments called hyphae. So we have these large mycelium that are made of these long filaments called hyphae. Now, many of the plants out there have a helpful relationship with different fungi, what we call symbionts or a symbiotic relationship. They cooperate together. And lichens are a really good example of that because they are obligate symbionts, meaning they have to be in a symbiotic relationship with an algae and a fungi. The algae basically do the photosynthetic part, providing a lot of the nutrients, and then the fungus provides takes that stuff made from photosynthesis, makes other nutrients, pulls in nutrients from maybe like the soil, pulls in water, and gives the algae a home. So fungi are really diverse. They're really different, and you wouldn't think that you have a lot in common with them, but you do. But now let's go ahead and get into the animals. So there's a lot of characteristics that distinguish animals from other organisms. As we've already mentioned, they're heterotrophic. We have to eat other organisms for energy. We cannot make organic molecules from inorganic molecules like that. We also have to move. Now, this doesn't have to be all the time. It doesn't have to be at every stage of life. But at some point in an animal's lifetime, they have to be able to move. So we're looking at the key kind of characteristics of all animals. Being heterotrophic, having movement at some point in time, and that they're multicellular and usually have specialized body parts for different activities. Now, we do want to be careful that we're not going to fall into a trap of thinking that there are higher or lower organisms. All evolution does is lead to adaptations, not necessarily greater complexity. So we're going to see a variety of different animals of varying levels of complexity. Being more complex doesn't mean you're more evolutionarily advanced. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best. So if an organism exists, it's because it's been successful at life. Things like finding food, getting away from predators, and reproducing. And every organism has adaptations that will allow it to survive under its current conditions. The four distinct characteristics are going to be used to organize animals, but again, it's not necessarily saying this is a higher or lower level. Now, we're going to be looking at the major phyla. You're not going to have to memorize this figure, but there are some key things I'll point out. And the things I point out are the things that you should commit to memory and write down. So we're looking at these different types of animals and how do we categorize them. So what are some of the things we look at to categorize animals? And some of these are going to be things that you will, once it's explained, will make total sense. So when we look at the animals, we have these various groups. We have the sponges, the cnidarians, the flatworms, the annelids, the mollusks, the roundworms, the arthropods, the echinoderms, and the chordates. And so some sort of ancestral protist started back here, and then we saw divergence. And on one side, we saw the divergence towards the sponges. Now, the sponges is probably the last thing you would think of when you think of an animal because they don't have specialized defined tissues. And so they don't really look or feel animal-like. We think of a sponge and we probably think of what's in our bathroom or what's in our kitchen. But I guarantee you these guys, these are aquatic animals for sure. Right, because again, remember, in order to be considered an animal, you just have to be consuming other living organisms, being heterotrophic. So we have the sponges that do not have any sort of defined tissue, and then we have the cnidarians. So this is where we're looking at symmetry. So this is something that you won't have to memorize who has radial or bilateral symmetry, but you should be able to tell me what radial or bilateral symmetry is, and if I provide you a picture of different organisms telling me which one has which. Right? So radial symmetry basically means like a pizza. If you go and you cut your pizza into slices, it doesn't matter where you start. If you cut your pizza in half, it's going to be a mirror image on either side. Whether you cut it up, down, left, right, at a diagonal, it doesn't matter. You're still going to have a mirror image on the other side. So that's radial symmetry, and we see that with the cnidarian. If we were to look top down at this jellyfish, which is a cnidarian, then we could basically slice that jellyfish in half at various angles or at various directions, and you'd still end up with a mirror image on either side. Bilateral symmetry means there's only one way to cut to get a mirror image. So humans are a good example of bilateral symmetry in that if you cut someone across at the waist, and I'm not condoning this, but if you were to cut someone across at the waist, you'd have legs on the bottom and a torso and arms and a head up top. They're not a mirror image of each other. If you cut from down from top to bottom, separating the front from the back, then you have a face in the front, you have a belly button in the front, you have toes in the front, but you don't have those things in the back side. So it's not a mirror image. The only way to cut a human down to get mirror images is to go from top to bottom, down between the eyes, down the middle of the torso and between the legs. Right, and then you have a mirror image, but there's only one way to do it. So we call that bilateral symmetry. So again, I don't expect you to memorize groups and what type of symmetry they have, but if you're shown pictures or given a description, then you should be able to tell me that. Now, during development, does the animal get developed from front to back or back to front? So there are two different types of development for developing the digestive system. You can either develop mouth first, in which case you're a protostome, or you can develop anus first, in which case you're a deuterostome. And so you'd like to think that as humans we would develop mouth first, but we don't. Almost everything develops as a protostome, so flatworms, annelids, mollusks, roundworms, and arthropods. So their first opening of their digestive system is the mouth. And if you're an echinoderm or a chordate, so things like starfish or mammals, then you develop anus first. Again, I'm not going to expect you to memorize the groups, but you should be able to tell me the difference between protostomes and deuterostomes. And if I give you a description saying that annelids form their gut mouth first, then you should be able to tell me that they're a protostome. Now, when we look at how the body grows, do we grow continuously by just adding to the body, or do we molt? And so basically, like adding to the body, that's going to be your flatworms, annelids, and mollusks. We're just constantly growing more. Whereas things like arthropods and roundworms, they have to basically shed an exterior off in order to grow bigger. Otherwise, they will like be constrained by their kind of exoskeleton. And then the echinoderms, chordates, we've already determined they are going to be developing anus first. So it's really, really interesting. But what we see, like when we're looking at this, we're kind of placing it in what feels like the most ancestral to what's most current or most new. But what we've really seen is that it's really been a slightly different kind of development, that there are complex marine animals called ctenophores that probably came first, and then we kind of went back down and simplified later on to become the sponges. And then the rest of the animals came after that. So there's an interesting look. When we look at DNA, we see that complexity developed first, that there's another group that we don't see here called the ctenophores, and that the sponges developed later on, going from complex to more simplified. So again, sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution given the current circumstances. And so we don't want to necessarily categorize these guys by complexity and putting them in higher or lower levels like that. Sometimes we lose traits, sometimes we simplify traits, simply because that is the best solution we have under those current conditions. Now, how did we even get to land in the first place? Animals started in water. We started with things like fish, and then we began colonizing land. But in order to go from water to land, you need 3 special adaptations that developed over time. Now we're going to look at the problems first, and then we'll look at the solutions. So if you're in the water, and you want to move to land, the 3 main obstacles you're going to face is A, respiration. You went from underwater to now an air-based atmosphere. That's totally different. You're going to have problems with gravity. Water's very buoyant. You don't really need to fight gravity so much, but now that you're on land, you're feeling gravity full force. And then the last problem is egg desiccation, meaning that your eggs are going to have to fight drying out. Because there's no water around them, then how do you keep the eggs moist and viable? Otherwise they'll dry out and die. So let's go into how we basically fixed these problems, or how we developed solutions to these problems. And these are things that you should know: the 3 main obstacles and the 3 main solutions. So with respiration, we had gills. We took oxygen that was dissolved in the water, and that's how we basically breathed. But now we have to extract oxygen from the air, and that's totally different. And so in that case, we needed to develop air sacs, which were the evolutionary precursors to things like the swim bladder that we find in rayfinch fishes today. We took those air sacs, we modified them into lungs. And so the lungs that we use today to breathe on land are developed from the air sacs that fish originally had. Now with the problem of gravity, right, we're in a buoyant water environment. We don't need to really fight against gravity. So how do we hold ourselves upright, right? If you take a fish and you put it on land, it's just going to lay there. It can't hold itself up. And so we had to modify those fins into limbs and then modify the vertebra. So we evolved limbs from the jointed fins on the underside of lobed-finned fishes. So there were already some fishes that had some bony structures in their fins, and we just basically modified those over time until they became more of like a shoulder and an elbow and a wrist. And then the vertebrae were modified to transmit the body weight through the limbs. So now instead of the spine just kind of holding us in place, we are now using the spine to transmit that weight through the limbs so we can hold ourselves up. And then the last problem of egg desiccation, right? In aquatic eggs, they're very jelly-like because we're basically taking oxygen, we're taking nutrients and supplies from the surrounding water. But on land, we're not going to have that luxury. So we have to make an all-encompassing egg with a waterproof shell. And so the amniotic egg is the solution in that we now have a shell that is hard, that is waterproof. It doesn't have to be hard like a chicken egg necessarily, but is much harder, is waterproof, and it's going to prevent the eggs from drying out. So it has a yolk in there that will sustain the developing egg, the developing embryo, while it's in the shell until it's ready to crack out of the egg. But that was the main solution to fighting off the dehydration process. So overall, we've made some really big changes going from water to land, and we're looking at things that took a very, very long time. If you choose to do one of the extra credit assignments, it will go into the problem of going from water to land. It'll actually go into this, mainly looking at the respiration and the gravity problems. And so it's maybe a good idea to even just watch it just to get a better understanding. And then of course, you can always do the assignment and get those points.